Clarence Thomas had long kept a low profile, rarely stepping into controversy. But that quiet streak ended the day Jasmine Crockett put his silence on trial. What was meant to be a routine congressional oversight hearing suddenly turned into a spectacle no one could ignore. Held in room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, the session was initially expected to be uneventful, low attendance, low stakes. But one name on the witness list changed everything. Justice Clarence Thomas. He was scheduled to answer questions on judicial ethics, a topic that had recently ignited headlines following revelations about undisclosed luxury trips and gifts tied to billionaire Harlan Crow. By 10 a.m., nearly every major network was in live streaming. The room buzzed with anticipation, the press unusually alert. Then Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took her seat. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that warns you the real questions are coming. Her voice calm, respectful. Justice Thomas, thank you for being here today. I'd like to walk through a few items that have raised public concern. Not speculation, not innuendo, just facts. Thomas nodded politely, appearing relaxed. But Crockett didn't give him time to settle. Since 2001, she began, you've reportedly accepted gifts and trips from billionaire Harlan Crow, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, private jets, yacht vacations, real estate transactions. Is that accurate? Tension tightened across the room. Thomas leaned into the mic. Those were personal friendships, Congresswoman, long-standing relationships. I appreciate that, Crockett replied, cutting in softly. But the concern isn't about who your friends are. It's about whether a sitting Supreme Court justice should accept gifts of that magnitude without disclosing them, especially when those same individuals have political or legal interests. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched. Crockett stayed steady. One question after another, each more direct, more precise. Did you ever recuse yourself from a case where Harlan Crow had a financial interest? Thomas shuffled. His notes. I've always adhered to the rules and guidelines provided to me. That wasn't the question, she said. Did you ever recuse? A pause. No, I did not find it necessary. The room shifted. Crockett leaned forward. There are high school teachers in my district who have to file more detailed financial disclosures than we've seen from a sitting Supreme Court justice. How does that build public trust? It wasn't about catching him off guard. It was methodical, patient, surgical. People watching from home started taking notice. Social media lit up. Journalists scribbled faster. And Clarence Thomas, the longest-serving member on the bench, was visibly under pressure, and Crockett wasn't done. With a deliberate shift, she turned to a subject no one expected. Not Thomas, but his wife. Justice Thomas, she began, we've discussed your financial disclosures. But there's another issue that also concerns the American people. Your wife, Ginni Thomas. You could feel the air change. Aides behind Thomas looked up sharply. Eyes darted. My wife is not the one being questioned here today, Thomas said carefully. That's correct, Crockett replied. But her actions, particularly in connection with efforts to influence or undermine the 2020 election, raised serious concerns about impartiality. And those concerns directly relate to your role on the court. She paused, then asked plainly, did you discuss any aspect of the 2020 election or its outcome with your wife while she was in contact with individuals attempting to overturn the results? Thomas looked ahead, silent. And in that silence, the message landed harder than any answer could. Avoiding her gaze, he tightened his grip on the edge of the desk. No, he said at last. I did not discuss the details of any case with my wife. Not any case, Crockett repeated, her voice steady. But did you discuss the outcome of the election with her? There was another pause. "That's a private matter," he replied. "That's not acceptable." She fired back without missing a beat. "Your wife was texting the White House, Chief of Staff urging him to overturn the election, and you were the only justice who voted against releasing those communications to investigators. That's not private. That's public accountability." She flipped through her binder with practiced ease. Then read aloud, March 24, 2022, Ginni Thomas texted, "Do not concede. It takes time for the army who is gathering for his back." She had access to the top of the administration. While sending messages like that, so I ask you, how can the public trust the court's impartiality when a sitting justice's spouse is that politically involved? The room went still. No whispers, no shuffling papers, no coughs. Thomas said nothing. Crockett read the silence and leaned in. "I want to remind you of something, Justice," she said, her tone sharpening. "You are not just a man behind a bench. You are 1/9 of the body that interprets the laws governing this entire country. If your own household has ties to operations aimed at overturning an election, that's not just bad optics, that's a threat to our democracy." Thomas finally spoke again. "I respectfully disagree." "Respectfully," Crockett echoed. "Disagreement isn't a defense when the facts are already on the record." Then she leaned back and let the silence settle again. There had been no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Just questions, sharp, direct, and deeply unsettling for the man across from her in just a few minutes. Crockett had done what few dared. She connected ethical negligence with political compromise, and the person at the center wasn't a donor or lobbyist, it was Thomas's own wife. The weight of it sank in. Members of the committee shifted uncomfortably. One Republican leaned toward the chair, whispered something, and was quietly waved off. No one interrupted. Not yet, because everything Crockett asked was real, and the country was watching in Fort Wayne. Indiana, Nora Beasley, a retired civics teacher, watched from her couch. She had taught government for over 30 years and shook her head. "This," she muttered, "is what should have been happening all along." It wasn't just a DC moment. It was being clipped, shared, whispered about across barbershops, newsrooms, and kitchen tables. Someone, finally, was saying the quiet part out loud. But Crockett wasn't finished. She knew this couldn't stop at one hearing or one confrontation, because if you could trace a thread from undisclosed gifts to political texts to court decisions, what else could be connected? And just as she prepared her next line of questioning, a low voice interrupted. Sharp, controlled, and brimming with irritation. "Madam Chair, point of order." The interruption sliced through the tension like a knife. It was Congressman Bennett. Rusk of Wyoming, all polished cufflinks and practiced deflection. Already speaking before being acknowledged. "With all due respect to the Congresswoman, this is a hearing on judicial ethics, not a political witch hunt. Dragging a justice's spouse into this is irrelevant and inflammatory." Crockett didn't flinch. She turned, slow and deliberate, her voice cool. "With all due respect, Congressman, conflicts of interest that impact national legal outcomes are exactly what this hearing is about. The spouse of a sitting justice is involved in political activity related to cases before the court. That's not irrelevant. That's the definition of a conflict." Rusk opened his mouth again. But before he could object, Chairperson Repotts Halloran raised a hand. "She's within her time. Let her continue." And the room fell silent once more. Rusk sank into his seat, clearly fuming, but Crockett didn't miss a beat. She turned back to Justice Thomas, whose demeanor had shifted, his hands clenched tightly. Fingers interlaced, tension showing in the white of his knuckles. He wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny, especially not from someone who refused to be intimidated by his robe, his title, or his legacy. "Justice Thomas," she began, lifting a printed email chain. These are communications between Ginni Thomas and Arizona lawmakers' emails where she directly encouraged them to reject certified election results and choose their own electors. That's not opinion. That's verified and public record. She let the papers fall flat on the desk. Were you aware of these emails before they were made public? Thomas exhaled, slow and measured. No, I was not. You never once discussed your wife's involvement in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Crockett pressed. I did not. Crockett's eyes locked on his. Interesting. Because any other public official with that level of proximity to a coordinated political effort would be expected, if not required, to recuse themselves from cases even remotely related. But you didn't, not even when the court was asked to weigh in on those very disputes. Thomas leaned into the microphone. The court operates independently. Congresswoman, I'm sure that's the impression you'd like the public to hold, she replied. But independence isn't invisibility. You don't get to operate in silence and expect Americans to trust that your decisions are free of bias. The room thickened with tension. Outside the chamber, reporters pounded away at keyboards. Clips of the exchange were already trending. In a Santa Fe cafe, 2 law students whispered across their laptops, "She's not letting go." In Toledo, a retired judge muttered to his wife, "He's in trouble." Back in the hearing room, Crockett continued, "This isn't just about one case, or even one election. It's about the perception, the growing, justified perception that the Supreme Court is beyond reproach, beyond transparency, and dangerously untouchable." She swept her gaze across the room before returning to Thomas. "You have lifetime tenure. You're shielded from nearly every form of accountability. But scrutiny, you're not immune to that. And right now, millions of Americans are watching, wondering just how far this goes." Thomas didn't speak. His silence no longer felt like commit, felt like calculation. "Justice Thomas," Crockett said finally, "can you tell the American people why your household's involvement in one of the most contentious political events in our history doesn't warrant full transparency from this court?" Thomas opened his mouth, paused, then closed it again. The chair leaned forward. "Justice, your answer? I believe I've said all I can on the matter." Crockett gave a single nod, then turned off her mic. There was no outburst, no raised voices, but the weight of what had just occurred settled like a storm cloud over the chamber. Outside, America wasn't just watching the news, they were paying attention. By mid-afternoon, over 2.3 million people had viewed the hearing. Clips of the exchange dominated social feeds. Hashtags were trending. Op-eds were being drafted. And in legal circles, eyes were turning to the calendar because this wasn't just oversight anymore. Back in the room, Congressman Rusk stirred again, but this time he wasn't alone. Down the row, Representative Lowell Braddock of Idaho, stoic and silver-haired, pushed his mic button with theatrical precision. "Madam Chair," he began, "this hearing is devolving into a smear campaign. I move to strike the last 5 minutes of questioning from the record. It mischaracterizes the witness and attacks a private citizen who isn't here to defend herself." The tension snapped taut. Crockett's aides shifted nervously behind her. Was this procedural drama or the start of something bigger? Crockett remained steady. She pressed her mic button once more. "Mr. Braddock, if you're suggesting that citing a public investigation widely reported by credible outlets amounts to a smear, I suggest you revisit the entire purpose of congressional oversight. We're not here to shield the powerful from discomfort." Braddock scoffed. "And we're not here to stage viral political theater." Crockett's reply was calm, cutting. "I don't need viral clips. I need accountability, and frankly, it's long overdue." The chair cut in before things escalated further. Motion denied. "Congresswoman Crockett's time has expired. We'll move to the next member." But the room didn't truly move on. The energy had shifted. A line had been crossed or perhaps finally drawn. Crockett had pulled on threads others had only glanced at for years. And now, those threads were unraveling in real time on Thomas's face, in his nervous hands, in the silence that had replaced his confidence. The next member, Representative D.D. Sloan, began speaking, but most eyes in the room were still on Crockett. She sat back, quiet, composed, and still watching, flipping through her notes with the calm precision of someone who wasn't done yet. Jasmine Crockett barely glanced up as the room buzzed around her. Outside the chamber, cameras clustered like bees, and reporters fired off real-time updates. One MSNBC producer messaged their group chat, "Crockett just changed how these hearings work." But the dust hadn't settled. Inside, after 2 milder rounds of questioning, Congressman Rusk requested a procedural recess. The chair paused, then approved. As members began filing out, Crockett stood, stretched, and moved quietly to the back. A young staffer followed closely behind. "They're rattled," the staffer whispered. "Phones are blowing up." Fox just cut into live coverage. Crockett simply nodded. "Good," she replied. "That means they're listening." Just outside the chamber doors, Rusk and Braddock stood in a tense huddle with 2 of Justice Thomas's legal aides. One aide, clearly on edge, muttered, "She went too far." Rusk leaned in. "We need to shut this down before she calls for recusal." "If she does, and the media latches on," he trailed off. The risk wasn't legal. It was public perception. Because Crockett hadn't just presented facts, she'd crafted a narrative. And the public was already buying in. Back inside, Thomas now sat alone at the witness table, noticeably shaken not because he lacked answers, but because he finally understood the questions weren't going away. Crockett returned to her seat silently, eyes forward, unshaken. She hadn't even begun the section on Ginni's finances, the dark money web, or the Leonard Leo network. Not yet. But the gavel struck again, and everyone in the room knew the energy had shifted. The hearing resumed, but the mood was different, quiet, yes, but uneasy. Justice Thomas looked weary, his tie-crooked collar tight, his earlier confidence drained. Then Crockett spoke. "With the chair's permission, I'd like to continue." "Proceed, Congresswoman," the chair said. She opened a folder and held up a page just high enough for Thomas to see. This financial disclosure form from 2017 lists income from a jointly owned rental property. But, according to ProPublica, that property was sold in 2014 and that sale was never reported. Thomas blinked, shifting uncomfortably. "That was a clerical oversight," he said quickly. "Nothing intentional." Crockett didn't flinch. 3 years of non-disclosure isn't a typo. That's a pattern. And it wasn't just one property, was 3. All sold to a political donor. Thomas tried again. "I had been advised disclosure wasn't required." "Who advised you?" Crockett interrupted. He hesitated. "Too long," he turned to his counsel. Silence. "I don't recall the name," he finally said. "You don't recall the name of the person who told you not to report transactions involving a political donor?" Crockett asked, her voice steady. "That's convenient." Thomas looked trapped. His gaze darted to the chair, then back. "I've never tried to hide anything from the American people." Crockett leaned in slightly. "Justice Thomas, intent isn't what's on trial here. It's the effect. And failing to disclose transactions involving political donors damages the very foundation of judicial neutrality." The silence that followed her words was deafening, even Thomas's usual. Defenders stayed quiet. This wasn't about partisan lines anymore. It was about trust. "There was no corruption," Thomas muttered, fiddling with his pen. "Corruption isn't always about money in a briefcase," Crockett replied. "Sometimes it's about silence." About knowing the rules and stepping just far enough outside them to protect your power. The room stayed silent. But outside, the country was already awakened, watching. Flipping through her notes like someone with far more left to say, she remained calm while the cameras zoomed in and journalists fired off live updates. One MSNBC producer messaged a group chat. Crockett just rewrote the rules of these hearings. But it wasn't over. Inside, after 2 rounds of softer questioning, Congressman Rusk requested a recess. The chair hesitated, then granted it as the room began to clear. Crockett rose, stretched, and walked toward the back of the chamber. A young staffer followed, whispering, "They're rattled. Phones are blowing up." Fox cut into live coverage. Crockett gave a single nod. "Good," she said. "That means they're listening." Meanwhile, just outside the room, Rusk and Braddock were in a quiet huddle with 2 of Thomas's legal aides. One aide, visibly tense, muttered, "She went too far. We need to call it out." Rusk replied under his breath, "We need to regain control before she calls for recusal." She discerned, "If the press runs with it, we've got a real problem." They weren't thinking about legal repercussions. They were thinking about public perception. Because Crockett hadn't just cited facts, she'd told a story. And the country was already buying into it, back in the chamber. Thomas sat alone at the witness table for the first time, looking not unprepared, but uncertain. The questions were still coming in. Now he knew they weren't going away. Crockett returned to her seat without saying a word or checking her phone. Her expression made one thing clear. If they thought that last round was tough, they weren't ready for what came next. She hadn't even touched the financial entanglements involving Ginni, or the dark money networks connected to Leonard Leo, and the judicial lobbying machine. Not yet, but as the gavel dropped to resume the hearing, everyone in that room could feel it. The energy had shifted, and Crockett was far from done. The hearing resumed. This time, the room was quiet, in a different the kind of quiet where everyone pretends nothing's changed when everything clearly has. Thomas looked drained, his tie slightly off-center, collar tight. Whatever confidence he had earlier was gone. Crockett. Oh. She looked like she was just getting started. Her mic lit up. "I'd like to resume my questioning, with permission from the chair." Halloran nodded. "Proceed, Congresswoman." Crockett opened a folder and held up a page knot to the room, but just enough for Thomas to see. "This document," she said, "is a 2017 financial disclosure form. It lists income from a rental property you and your wife owned. But according to ProPublica, that property was sold in 2014, never reported." Thomas shifted. "I believe that was a clerical oversight," he said quickly. "Nothing intentional." Crockett didn't flinch. "Justice Thomas, it wasn't disclosed for 3 years. That's not a typo. That's a pattern. And it wasn't one property. It was 3, all purchased by a major political donor." "I was advised disclosure wasn't necessary," he said. "Who advised you?" she asked. He hesitated. Too long, then looked at his counsel. "I don't recall the name," he finally said. "You don't recall the name of the person who told you not to report a transaction involving a political donor?" she asked, incredulous. "That seems convenient." He looked trapped. "I've never tried to hide anything from the American people," he said. "Intent isn't the measure," Crockett replied. "It's the effect, and the effect of failing to disclose politically connected financial transactions. It undermines the very foundation of judicial neutrality." The silence was deafening. Even his usual defenders said nothing. This was no longer about politics. It was about credibility. And Crockett had hit a nerve. Thomas fidgeted. "There was no corruption." "Corruption isn't always a bag of cash," she said. "Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's knowing the rules and dodging them just enough to keep your power." Then she paused. And in this case, Justice Thomas, that silence has lasted decades. Inside, the room froze. Outside, it was chaos. Clips from the hearing were running non-stop TikToks, cable news, hashtags trending. I don't recall. The name was everywhere in Miami. A young political science professor named Ellis Darnell paused his lecture, rolled a TV to the front of the room, and told his students, "This is what real government tension looks like. Watch how quickly public trust shifts." Back inside, Crockett closed her folder. "Madam Chair, I yield." That ended her questioning for now. But the damage was done. Thomas had stumbled, and not the kind you recover from. His shoulders, once squared, now slouched. His hand trembled slightly as he took a drink. Across the room, Rusk whispered to Braddock. Braddock didn't respond. He didn't have to. They all knew what just happened. Justice Clarence Thomas, the one considered untouchable, had made a mistake. And Crockett hadn't yelled. She hadn't accused. She just asked the questions, then let the silence do the rest. But Crockett wasn't done. What came next wasn't about ethics, it was about influence, dark money, and how deep it all went. The hallway outside was packed with reporters. Inside, no one rushed the process now. They could all feel it. This was no longer a routine hearing. It was something bigger. Even Thomas sat quieter, more guarded. You could almost see the calculations in his head. How much more should he say? How much less? Then the chair called on her again. "Congresswoman Crockett, your final round." She leaned in not to perform, but to connect. "Let's talk about influence." A camera operator instinctively leaned forward. "We've talked about personal connections, your wife's involvement, your missing disclosures. Now I want to ask about something more systemic. Justice Thomas, are you familiar with the Concord Foundation?" He nodded. "Yes. For the record, it's a nonprofit that's funneled millions into shaping judicial nominations and legal strategies. You've spoken at their events. You've praised their work. So, do you think it's ethical for a sitting Supreme Court justice to be closely aligned with organizations that submit amicus briefs to your court?" "I don't believe association equals bias," he said. "But influence doesn't always show up as a check," Crockett said. "Sometimes it's applause. Sometimes it's proximity." A nod behind closed doors. She turned another page. "Since your name appears in reports connected to groups that received money from donors whose cases came before the court. In some, the rulings were 5-2 for and you were in the majority." Thomas stiffened. "Are you suggesting I was bought?" She shook her head. "No, I'm saying public trust in your rulings is at risk when money and influence surround your decisions. That's not just perception. That's an integrity crisis." He opened his mouth to speak, then didn't. "There's a reason people across this country are losing faith," she continued. "Because it feels like the rules don't apply to everyone. Because the more power someone has, the harder it is to hold them accountable." She leaned in not to intimidate, but to connect. "I don't care what party you vote for. I don't care what flag you fly. But if you wear that black robe and expect the American people to accept your rulings as final, then you need to live by a standard they can believe in." Thomas stayed silent, his face unreadable. But his silence said enough. And across the room, no one could deny it, something had shifted. Not just in the hearing, but in the system itself. Outrage wasn't needed. What unfolded was a calm, deliberate dismantling of one of the most protected figures in American law. Even the chair sat silent, knowing interruption wasn't necessary. In a modest apartment in Des Moines, Kayla Shelton, watching on her phone during her lunch break, texted her sister. "She's saying everything people like us been thinking for years." She wasn't someone who followed politics closely, But this felt different. Back in the hearing room, Crockett closed her folder and looked directly at Justice Thomas. Her final question cut straight through the room. If the roles were reversed, if it were a liberal justice married to a politically active spouse involved in an effort to overturn an election and who failed to disclose key financial ties, would you be calling for accountability? Thomas stared hard. Then, quietly, probably. The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed with unmistakable weight. Several staffers froze. Reporters caught mid-sentence, suddenly found their lead. Even Crockett, usually unshaken, blinked at the admission, but only for a second. She nodded.
Thank you.
She turned off her mic. That moment was the shift. Clarence Thomas, a man long known for silence, stoicism, and legal insulation, had just said the one thing that cracked his entire narrative: that his own standards for accountability might change depending on who was under scrutiny. The reaction was immediate. Though the hearing adjourned at 3:40 p.m., the real storm had already started. Phones lit up, newsrooms shifted into high gear, social media feeds exploded. The word probably looped endlessly on CNN, NBC, MSNBC. Fox attempted to frame it as a hypothetical. The internet didn't care. Within minutes, hashtags like #ProbablyGate, #RecusNow, and #Crockett vs. Thomas trended nationwide. By 4 p.m., Crockett's clips had over 11 million views. Inside the Capitol, staff scrambled for statements. Outside, reporters swarmed her as she exited the chamber. Calm and unhurried, she said only, "I asked what needed to be asked." When asked by a reporter whether she expected Thomas's response, she paused, smiled slightly, and replied, "I expected him to answer. I didn't expect him to admit it." That clip alone racked up 3 million views before nightfall. Meanwhile, Thomas's team scrambled. His longtime legal advisor, Landon Tress, appeared on 3 networks trying to downplay the moment. It was a hypothetical comment. But the damage was already done. No one was buying it. In Baltimore, civil rights lawyers gathered in a conference room watching the footage. Kamari Ellis stood slowly and said, "This isn't just a PR moment. This could shift how the public talks about the court." In Sacramento, a retired judge was asked whether Crockett crossed a line. Her reply was simple: no. She asked what others were too afraid to. By evening, headlines captured the weight of it. The day Crockett broke the silence. Ran in the Washington Post, Crockett's questioning could redefine judicial accountability, followed in Politico. But the most powerful reaction came from ordinary people. Thousands flooded Crockett's office calls, emails, handwritten notes. Many were grateful, some were angry. A few were disturbing. But one voicemail stood out, played on repeat in her Dallas office. "My name is Florence Powell. I'm 72 years old. I watched every minute of that hearing. I cried when he said, probably because I've lived long enough to know men like him don't say that unless they're cornered. Thank you, Congresswoman." Outside the public eye, action was already taking shape. Ethics watchdogs submitted formal requests to investigate Thomas's failure to recuse himself from post-election cases. The American Bar Association issued a cautious but firm call to reevaluate ethical standards for Supreme Court justices. Behind closed Senate doors, progressive lawmakers quietly considered demanding Thomas recuse himself from future election-related rulings. It was bold, maybe symbolic, but no one could deny the shift had begun. The fact that it was even being talked about was, in itself, unprecedented. As for Justice Thomas, he stayed out of sight. No cameras, no statements, no denials. Just silence. But this silence didn't settle anything. It wasn't calming, it was condemning, while Washington scrambled to process what had just unfolded. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was already looking ahead. In a quiet, off-the-record conversation with a few aides, she made it clear, he's not the only one. We're going to keep pulling this thread. The robe doesn't make you untouchable. One aide hesitated. What if they come after you? Crockett didn't blink. They already have. That's not new. What's new is the public's finally watching. They're not looking away anymore. That evening, she turned down every media request. No interviews, no Sunday roundtables, no grandstanding. Instead, she posted a simple video from her desk. No production value, no edits. Just her, facing the camera directly. I asked the questions because no one else was. She said, not for the spotlight, not for attention, but because trust in our institutions is crumbling, and trust doesn't rebuild itself. By midnight, over 8 million people had seen it, but the real surprise came the next morning when Ginni Thomas broke her silence. At 9:07 a.m. sharp, inboxes across Capitol Hill exploded with a press release from the law firm representing Virginia, Ginni Thomas. The subject line was blunt. Enough is enough. The message inside was fierce. Ginni Thomas categorically denies any wrongdoing, ethical breaches, or coordination with her husband regarding any election-related matters. It called the scrutiny of her actions a reckless, defamatory attempt to weaponize lawful political expression, and accused Crockett of launching a personal crusade. Driven by partisanship, but it was the closing line that grabbed everyone's attention. Mrs. Thomas is prepared to testify under oath if called upon by the proper committee in defense of her name, her conduct, and her constitutional rights. It was a calculated move, and within minutes, every major news outlet had picked it up. CNN ran a banner headline. The New York Times had a breaking alert by 10. Fox News framed it as a win, painting the hearing as a smear campaign gone wrong. Crockett wasn't fazed. Outside her office that morning, surrounded by reporters, she gave a calm response. If Mrs. Thomas wants to testify under oath, we welcome that. Because this isn't about personal politics. It's about transparency and accountability things the public has been denied for far too long. That quote was everywhere within the hour. In Pittsburgh, a civics teacher paused his lesson and streamed the press conference live. His students, many watching Congress in action for the first time, sat transfixed. One finally muttered, "Yo, this is actually real." It was real, and it was just getting started. Behind the scenes, Crockett's staff began working with legal experts to draft the next step. If Ginni Thomas was serious about testifying, they were ready. But they had conditions: no secrecy. Closed-door discussions, no softballs. It had to be public. Later that night, in her D.C. apartment, Crockett met privately with a small group of trusted legal minds. No cameras, no aides. Just strategy. One advisor cautioned, "Don't push too hard yet. Let her speak first. Let her walk into it." Crockett swirled her tea, thinking, "She wants the spotlight," she said. "Let's give her the stage." Across town, Ginni's legal team was doing the same, preparing her for what they thought would be a brief, media-friendly appearance. But they didn't know what Crockett had planned. Not yet. Their mistake wasn't arrogance, was underestimating the precision with which Crockett had built her case. This wasn't about catching Ginni Thomas in a contradiction. It was about tracing the entire web from her involvement in post-election chaos, 2 emails sent to state legislators, to the financial trails linking her nonprofit advocacy efforts with potential legal influence. Piece by piece, Crockett's team was constructing something far more damning than Ginni had expected. And by now, the public's interest had shifted. This was no longer just a question of ethics, it was about legitimacy, about how far unelected influence could reach into the highest court in the country. Cable news lit up that night. Pundits clashed. Some praised Ginni for calling what they called a bluff. Others warned she was walking into a buzzsaw. But something else began to take shape. Two more women started to speak up. A former law clerk from 2006 posted on X, "We were always told to stay out of the Thomas orbit." Everyone knew Ginni was involved in more than she let on. Another former staffer from a legal advocacy group told The Guardian anonymously, there were serious concerns about how her lobbying overlapped with Supreme Court scheduling. We were told never to leave anything sensitive in writing. What were once whispers were now headlines. And behind all of it was Crockett, quiet, focused, strategic. She wasn't gloating. She was working. Because she knew this wasn't about a single win, it was about revealing a system that had long gone unchecked. While media panels argued and lawyers drafted statements, something started happening outside the halls of power. The streets stirred. People were no longer waiting on verdicts, they were mobilizing. By Friday afternoon, the energy had left Washington and landed in neighborhoods across the country. In dozens of cities, people weren't just watching, they were showing up. Outside the Supreme Court, a crowd began to form. It started small, signs, candles, curious onlookers. But by nightfall, more than 3,000 people had packed the sidewalks. Some held constitutions. Others held signs with a simple quote, "Would you call for accountability, Justice Thomas?" In Columbus, law students and professors held a teach-in on judicial ethics. In Austin, activists screened Crockett's questioning downtown on loop. In Tucson, a woman named Gloria brought folding chairs and water bottles to a park, inviting strangers to sit down and talk. It wasn't a traditional protest. It was deeper, more personal. People were angry. Yes, but they were thoughtful, reflective, wondering how something this powerful had remained in the dark for so long. Across the political spectrum, reactions poured in. Avery Rollins, a former federal prosecutor, told NPR, "This isn't just party politics anymore. It's about public expectations. When even the highest court appears above the rules, democracy starts to fracture." Late-night shows aired clips with uncharacteristic seriousness. Trevor Norris opened his monologue not with jokes, but with a question. When one woman asking questions can rattle the highest court in the land, who's really holding the power? In Kansas City, a pastor paused his sermon to say, "I'm not telling you who to vote for. But when someone speaks truth to power with nothing to gain, that's leadership." Even conservative media was split. Some defended Thomas. Others, like the American Law Review, published a stark editorial. Public service at the highest level demands more than silence. Americans deserve answers when the appearance of impropriety is this loud. Ginni's legal team tried to regain control, issuing another statement Saturday. This time, they said her testimony would depend on terms that protected her constitutional rights and personal dignity. But the story had already moved beyond spin. This wasn't about one controversy anymore, it was about a broader reckoning. Millions of Americans now questioned whether the court truly answered to anyone at all. Crockett stayed mostly quiet that weekend. No interviews, no tweets. Just a short statement from her office. Congresswoman Crockett thanks the public for their engagement and their voices. She remains committed to transparency and accountability, no matter where the questions lead. In Jackson, a grandmother taped that quote to her front door. In Santa Rosa, a history teacher played Crockett's clip again for his class and asked, "What happens when people finally start paying attention?" One student, just 17, replied, "Feels like they can't hide behind the robe anymore." By Sunday night, major polling firms were already seeing shifts. The silence was over. Their error wasn't arrogance. It was failing to realize just how precisely Crockett had constructed her argument. She wasn't looking for contradictions. She was tracing a clear line from her role in the post-election chaos to coordinated emails with state legislators to financial links between advocacy work and legal influence. Bit by bit, her team was assembling a case far more detailed than Ginni Thomas had expected. And by then, a public mood had shifted. This was no longer a discussion about ethics. It had become a confrontation with legitimacy itself. People were asking how far unelected influence reached into the highest court in the land. That evening, cable news exploded with debate. Some pundits applauded Ginni for standing her ground, while others warned she'd underestimated the force she was up against. But something else was happening. Women were speaking up. A former law clerk from 2006 posted on X, saying, "We were always told to steer clear of the Thomas circle." Everyone knew Ginni had her hands in more than she admitted. Another former staffer from a legal nonprofit told The Guardian, anonymously, "We were advised never to leave anything sensitive in writing." There were genuine concerns about overlap between her lobbying efforts and Supreme Court schedules. What had once been whispers were now becoming testimony. And through it all, Crockett remained focused, strategic, steady, not looking for attention. She wasn't smiling. She was working, because she understood this wasn't going to end with one headline. By Friday, the outrage wasn't just digital. It was physical. In cities across the country, people began gathering. In Washington, D.C., a crowd formed outside the Supreme Court. At first, it was quiet, just signs, conversations. By nightfall, over 3,000 people had filled the sidewalks. Some held candles. Others held pocket constitutions. Many held signs quoting Crockett's questioning, "Would you call for accountability?" In Ohio, law students hosted a public forum on judicial ethics. In Austin, Crockett's questioning played on a screen downtown. In Tucson, a woman named Gloria brought folding chairs and water bottles to her local park and invited strangers to sit and discuss. It wasn't rage, it was reflection. People were talking, asking how this had been allowed to happen in plain sight. Across party lines, reactions poured in. Former federal prosecutor Avery Rollins told NPR, "This isn't about politics, it's about trust. If even the Supreme Court is seen as unaccountable, the damage is systemic." Late-night shows ran clips of the hearing with quiet commentary. Comedian Trevor Norris opened his show without a joke. When one woman's questions shake the most powerful court in the country, he said, "We need to ask who's actually holding the power and why they've gone so long without being questioned." Even churches responded. In Kansas City, Pastor Louis Caldwell told his congregation, "I won't tell you how to vote, but when someone stands up with truth and no personal gain, I call that leadership." Conservative media split down the middle. Some dismissed Crockett as politicizing the judiciary, but others, like American Law Review, surprised readers with a sharp editorial. Justice isn't just about legal procedure. It's about public faith. When appearance alone casts doubt, accountability isn't optional. Ginni Thomas's legal team released a weekend statement, clarifying she'd testify only under terms that protect her constitutional rights. But the momentum had already shifted. The story wasn't growing because of headlines. It was growing because something deeper had been exposed. It wasn't just about one justice failing to disclose. It was about a Supreme Court that many Americans now feared had drifted too far from the people it was meant to serve. Over the weekend, Crockett stayed silent. No interviews, no social media. Just a brief message from her office. Congresswoman Crockett thanks the public for their voices. She remains committed to transparency and accountability wherever the questions lead. In Jackson, Mississippi, a grandmother taped those words to her front door. In Santa Rosa, California, a high school teacher played Crockett's clip for his students and asked, "What changes when the people start paying attention?" A 17-year-old student replied, feels like they can't hide behind the robe anymore. By Sunday night, polling firms released early numbers. A Gallup flash poll showed a 12-point drop in public trust toward the Supreme Court in just 5 days. Another poll showed 76% of Americans across party lines wanted stricter financial disclosures for justices. Back in Washington, quiet conversations had turned into plans. Because what started as a few sharp questions was now threatening something far older and more protected than most people had dared to challenge. But Monday came fast, and with it, a question no one could ignore. Would Clarence Thomas break his silence? The Supreme Court issued a public statement, not from Thomas himself, but from its information office. Justice Thomas will not be making a personal statement at this time. All duties continue as scheduled. No explanation, no repair, just silence. And that silence, instead of closing the door, only deepened the conversation by noon. Crockett had filed a formal request to the House Judiciary Committee. Draft. Legislation requiring mandatory financial disclosures for all Supreme Court justices with real penalties for failure. Her statement said, accountability shouldn't depend on public pressure. Integrity isn't optional. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was a cultural reckoning. Social media wasn't divided along party lines. People were asking real questions. Who has power? Who protects it? And who has the courage to question it? Students shared Crockett's.com voice. Veterans posted about the Constitution they defended. Teachers made her hearing a civics case study, and a quiet truth kept rising. This could have stayed buried, if not for one person refusing to let it. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack. She asked questions. Simple, clear, fair. Did you disclose this? Did you recuse? Did you talk to your spouse about national matters? Would you expect accountability from others? Questions that any honest person could answer. But when people in power can't or won't, that's when the public knows something's broken. People didn't need a law degree to feel it. They just needed someone to name it. In Oklahoma, a retired coal miner told his grandson, that lady in Congress. She made me feel like someone finally gives a damn. In Oakland, a law student scribbled in her notebook, I don't want to be a lawyer who wins. I want to be one who matters. This is how stories grow, not with noise, but with truth told at the right moment. Where does it go now? That depends on who keeps watching. Thomas remains on the bench. Ginni hasn't testified. The court continues, but it's no longer untouchable. Now, millions of eyes are on it. And that, more than anything, may be the strongest form of accountability the court has faced in years. Crockett didn't try to be famous. She just didn't waste her chance to speak. And when she did, she reminded the country that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits down, opens a folder, and simply refuses to pretend that everything is fine. And if you're still watching, you're still asking, then this story isn't over. It's just getting started, because accountability doesn't come from the top. It comes from the people paying attention. From those who speak up. From those who ask better of their institutions and don't stop until they get it.